are there things that you do to get ready for a crisis that you advise clients to do on a regular, like sort of a template, if you will? I mean, each situation is unique, but when you talk to clients, sometimes it's not something that they want to do until there's a crisis, which is often too late. How do you work with clients?
Well, getting organizations to do a crisis plan, whether you call that a playbook, a plan, or a response protocol, getting them to do that ahead of time is tricky. What normally happens is there's a small crisis, a small issue. It feels like it could be a big one, and it's enough to scare the CEO, the general counsel, or a board member into saying, you know what, that was a close call. We should get more prepared to deal with a real crisis if one were to occur. So that's often an important inflection point. The other inflection point is if they are getting ready to become a public company, or if they're getting ready for a next big round of funding and they're expecting that additional scrutiny that could come with a crisis event. That's often another inflection point for them. What I often advise as the first thing to do before you even develop a crisis plan is just sit down and do a vulnerabilities analysis. Look at all of the potentially terrible things that could happen to your company, whether they are self-inflicted or externally caused, and then map those out and figure out which of those events are most likely to cause the biggest reputational damage and the biggest operational damage. And if you find 3 or 4 of those that are most likely to cause the most damage, get ready for those. And the best way to get ready for those is to have a full-blown crisis communications plan. But if you don't have a full-blown crisis communications plan, at least have a 1 or 2 page protocol of how you're going to respond in a crisis, and have some of the basic elements in place. Have media statements ready to go. Have a crisis team. Who's going to be the decision maker in that crisis team? Who's going to be involved in advising the decision maker on those specific issues? Who are the different audiences that you need to connect with and need to be advised of what's happening in that situation? And then how do you get to them? I can't tell you the number of times that we've wanted to get to customers and nobody knows how to effectively email all of the different customers that are customers or clients of a given company. Who owns those relationships? Is it the salesperson? Is it the CRM system? Is it this kind of back end weird email management system? Is it a file that sits on the CEO's desk? It's simple things like that get really complicated in a crisis situation, and you don't want to be figuring that out in the heat of the moment. So that would be my initial advice: is look at the things that could potentially happen, figure out how big of a risk those actually are, and then do a little bit of planning to make sure that you're ready to deal with those. And then, if you really want to, move down the crisis spectrum towards full preparedness, do a simulation. Sit around the table and test yourself. See what would happen if there's a cybersecurity incident. How would you respond to that? Who would you involve? Who are you going to call in? If there's a workplace violence incident, that's less of an issue today than it was, before the pandemic. But that used to be a real concern for, a certain number of companies. Is how would you deal with either a disgruntled employee or the significant other's ex who comes in and wants to cause problems? How do you deal with those? So my advice is always, it's better to be prepared. Most companies wait until a crisis actually happens, and then they pick up the phone and they call an agency, they call a consultant and say, help. Can you help? And then you just scramble. You work really fast, you work really hard, you try and follow crisis communications best practices, and you get the response done, as quickly and as effectively as you can. But it makes it so much easier if you've done a little bit of planning ahead of time.
Yeah,
and I think that planning is crucial. And one of the things you make a really good point that I think there's sort of an assumption that when you do crisis scenario planning, you have to come up with everything. You don't, because Murphy's Law will suggest that whatever you don't plan for is what you're going to end up with. But by practicing and putting best practices in on how to deal with a crisis, maybe not a specific crisis or not the crisis you're anticipating. You can always sort of take from the playbook and alter it. And I think a great example is, look at East Palestine. They weren't prepared for this, but their crisis communications, the town itself actually did a pretty good job of communicating effectively. And I think on the other end of the spectrum, I think all three of us remember Y2K. We planned to the nth fucking degree what we needed to do, and nothing happened. We literally had an intern run out to the ATM at midnight to check to see if they were working. So we had all these scenarios in place, and we didn't use them for that, but we used what we learned and what we applied elsewhere down the road.